So here we are, the final race data analysis for the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix for the finale of this 2021 Formula 1 season. This is the series in which I compile all of the race data that I have access to, mainly the lap times, and we pit each of the teammates against one another to see exactly how well they have performed in this race, as well as giving a general race overview as well with positions tables, lap time charts, and clean air running. Everything is all timestamped in the description down below, so please feel free to skip to whichever segment of the video you'd like me to talk about. But without further ado, let us jump on into the race data overview, and we begin with the positions table. And considering this Abu Dhabi track had massive modifications, there really weren't that many positional changes. All we can really see are the soft compound tyre runners coming in for their early pit stops around lap 14 to 18, and then we have the VSC period where Kimi Räikkönen ended up retiring. Equally, we can see that Lewis Hamilton led all bar 6 laps of this Grand Prix and ended up losing his 8th world title in very controversial circumstances. But moving away from the positions table, we can take a look at the overall lap time chart, which looks a little something like this. We can see a couple of those pit stops where lap times were around 110 seconds. We then see the VSC period, and then we see the safety car period right at the very end. But just zooming in on the section of racing that we are most interested in, we can see a whopping great big advantage in this opening portion of racing between Lewis Hamilton, Valtteri Bottas and Max Verstappen and the rest of the field. So there is about a second per lap difference between these, with Lewis Hamilton being around about 0.2 per lap quicker than Valtteri Bottas, and then about half a second quicker than Max Verstappen. And we see that this advantage is carried forward all the way into the second half of the race. However, the top 3 are near enough matching each other. There is no real difference between the top 3. And then again, at the very end, this is carried forward. This is very against the trend of lap times that we've seen so far this season. Usually what we would expect to see is these individual bands of racing, mainly in the first stint and sometimes in the second. And very rarely do we see distinct bands of racing in that last stint, which we can clearly see here, where once again it is Lewis Hamilton, Valtteri Bottas and Max Verstappen who are the top leading cars. And by Valtteri Bottas, I've meant to say Sergio Perez this entire segment. But it is absolutely phenomenal to see the pace advantage for this entire race being about a second per lap between Mercedes and Red Bull and the rest of the field. But we can take a look now at the gap to the race leader, which, like I said at the start, was for everything but 6 laps, was Lewis Hamilton. And we can see he had a comfortable lead at pretty much every single stage of this Grand Prix, but you have to just lead at the last lap. And we can see that apart from Max Verstappen in the grey and Sergio Perez in the yellow, everyone else was relatively close, but they had absolutely no pace on the top few drivers. But what we can do with all of these lap times now is we can isolate each driver's clean air lap running. I have a little algorithm which identifies any lap times that were set outside of a particular time window of the car in front. And once it identifies these laps, we then end up removing the slowest 30% and also the fastest 2, and we average what's left. And once we've done that across the entire race distance, we end up with a table that looks a little like this. Max Verstappen was declared the fastest driver in clean air by 3.5 tenths to Lewis Hamilton, which is designated by this gap column, which is also represented as a percentage. We will use this percentage to average across the races that have happened so far this year. Interestingly, we have the number of clean air laps each driver set, so there were 39 across this 58 lap race for Lewis Hamilton and 28 for Max Verstappen. With interestingly Gasly actually popping up above Valtteri Bottas, who really wasn't that quick in clean air. We then have the number of clean air laps represented as a percentage of the entire race distance and the standard deviation of said clean air laps to show each driver's consistency. But what we can do now is we can take that middle percentage gap column and we can average it across all of the races that have happened so far this year, excluding the couple of rainy races that have happened so far. Then once we've done that, we take the benchmark average and we subtract that value from every single driver, so the benchmark is set at 0% and everyone else is a percentage slower than that. And that table looks a little something like this. Max Verstappen across this entire season has been the fastest driver in clean air, but just only just by 0.06% per racing lap. Around the longer circuits that are about 100 seconds or 1 minute 40, that equates to just about 0.06 of a second per lap. And around the slightly shorter circuits, it's closer to about 0.04. And doing this exact calculation for the teams, we can see that Red Bull was just the quicker car in clean air, but again, only just by 0.02% per racing lap. Again, at circuits that are around 100 seconds or 1 minute 40, this is 0.02 per racing lap, and circuits that are closer to 70 seconds, that is around 1/100th per racing lap. Literally nothing. So to say definitively that one car was particularly faster than the other, I would strongly argue isn't the case. There was no one quicker car. Yes, at particular circuits, one car definitely had an advantage, but across the whole season, they were pretty much dead even. However, I will be making a video in the coming weeks or so near the end of this season, sort of collating all of the data that I can and from the different angles and different perspectives to decide who really did have the fastest car across this entire season. However, to visualize exactly where each of these drivers' clean air laps popped up, we have this graph here, and we can see that, interestingly, a large portion of them popped up in the first 50%. Now, this doesn't really happen, as the race hasn't had the time to formulate the gaps for drivers to slot into clean air spaces. However, what can be observed is that Lewis Hamilton had a significant chunk in the first 50% compared to Max Verstappen. Now, obviously, lap times set in the first 50% of the race are going to be significantly slower than those set in the last 50% due to the fuel loads. However, as we don't know the exact fuel loads that each team actually submitted, we can't actually correct for the fuel. So instead, what I have done is I have run back through this clean air lap analysis, but looking at just the stints and the stint breakdowns of each driver when they were on the same compound of tyre. And so for stint number 1, it looks a little something like this. We have the soft compound of tyre runners on the left and the mediums on the right. Drivers with a bracketed asterisk around their name were drivers who did run the soft or the medium compound of tyre that stint, but failed to set any clean air laps. So we can see on the soft compound of tyre, it was Sergio Perez who was 8.5 tenths faster than Carlos Sainz in clean air, and then Lewis Hamilton was 6.5 tenths faster than his own teammate in the same car. So then from stint number 1, we can take a look at stint number 2, where pretty much everybody ran the hard compound of tyre. And here it is where the Mercedes were massively quicker than everybody else. Again, a tenth between the two drivers, and then 5.5 tenths back to Yuki Tsunoda, who himself was faster than both Perez and Verstappen in stint 2 on those hards. Now, there were a few drivers who did a stint number 3 before the last safety car. Those were Leclerc going onto the mediums, and then Verstappen and Perez and Norris all going onto the hards once again. Now, what I haven't done is I haven't included stint number 4 for most of these drivers who changed tyres during the safety car period, as we only got one racing and lap out of it when the safety car was brought in. So there's literally no point in taking a look at that data, as it's not going to be representative whatsoever. But now that the race overview is all done and dusted and the clean air lap analysis is all complete, we will now break down each of the teammates. We are going in 2020 Constructors' Championship order, so we start with Mercedes and we'll end with Williams. However, I will be explaining exactly each of the graphs that will be popping up in the teams in the Mercedes panel, so we'll delve on through that right now. So on screen is that Mercedes panel. Starting in the top left, we have their lap time chart. We have Lewis Hamilton in the black line and Valtteri Bottas in the turquoise. Now, usually there would be a grey dotted line which would represent the fastest Mercedes car at the previous event at this circuit. However, as the circuit has undergone significant changes where the lap times were just over 10 seconds quicker, it is not worth comparing between the previous years. Directly below that, we have the Mercedes gaps chart, which denotes the gap on every single lap of this Grand Prix. In the top right, we have their positions chart, and then in the bottom right, we have their percentage pace difference. Now, this percentage pace difference graph takes all of Lewis Hamilton's lap times, will divide them all by Valtteri Bottas's lap times, and convert them to a percentage. Any percentage above 100 is where Lewis Hamilton is going faster, and any percentage below is when Valtteri Bottas is going faster. These percentages then get ordered from largest down to smallest, and we end up with this distribution that is seen on screen, which we can actually split down the middle, and we can see that for 17.2% of the laps raced, it was Valtteri Bottas in the turquoise who was the faster car, and therefore for 82.8%, it was Lewis Hamilton. But turning our attention to the overall lap time chart, we can see in stint number 1, there was a 2-second gulf between the two drivers, sometimes 1.5, but majoritively it was 2 seconds. This was able to raise the gap in Hamilton's favour to almost 30 seconds by lap 14. Now this was mainly because Hamilton had the race lead and Valtteri Bottas was stuck in P8 in traffic. Then by this dark green arrow on lap 20, we have Lewis Hamilton being slowed down significantly into the 1:33s by Sergio Perez, who is holding him up to defend against Max Verstappen. We then see immediately after this incident, Hamilton is straight back to his 1:28, and again a second per lap better than Valtteri Bottas, who actually by the end of the race manages to close this difference down to about 0.6 per lap. However, the overall gap before the safety car was brought in had reached 70 seconds. Then unfortunately at the safety car it was Valtteri Bottas and both Lewis Hamilton who actually lost out, as Valtteri Bottas was running P4 and then at the end of the safety car he was running P6. But taking a look at Mercedes' lap times overall, we can see that in clean air there was a 6.5 difference between the two drivers. But in stint number 1, it was 6.5 in Hamilton's favour, and in stint number 2, when they were both on the hards, it was 1/10 difference, again in Hamilton's favour. So Valtteri Bottas definitely got quicker as the race went on, he just started in traffic. And so moving from Mercedes, we'll now take a look at Red Bull. And again, splitting that percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 38.2% it was Sergio Perez in the dark blue line who was the faster car, and therefore for 61.8% it was Max Verstappen in the light blue. Now, very interestingly for Red Bull, they are setting nearly identical lap times for the whole Grand Prix. Now, this pretty much has never happened throughout this Red Bull season. At every single stage where Verstappen goes slightly quicker, Perez will match him, even in that second and third stint as well, after all of their pit stops and the VSC periods. Now, this may be a case of Sergio Perez absolutely nailing the strategy and nailing the performance of this car, or Max Verstappen slightly trailing off, or there could be a little bit more of a nefarious reason for this speed for Sergio Perez. Now, it has been suggested by a couple of freelance journalists and a couple of rumours in the paddock that Red Bull underfueled Sergio Perez's car. Now, to what extent Sergio Perez was underfueled, we're not too sure. However, we can assume it to be about 5 or 6 laps. This is why Sergio Perez is so close in pace to Max Verstappen all of a sudden, when across the whole season so far, he hasn't really come anywhere close to Verstappen's pace. Which could also be a reason why he was retired with no real reason given. They didn't tell him on the radio why they had to retire. They haven't really stated in the post-race interviews why he had to retire. He was in a podium position behind the safety car. They're not running at racing speed. Surely you can take the car that does have a terminal issue, like they were going to do in Baku when he stopped on track, all the way to that checkered flag. However, if they actually did underfuel that car, they knew they weren't going to get to the end and could have faced disqualification from the race. Ultimately, that wouldn't have mattered, as he did actually end up retiring due to an unknown reason at the checkered flag. But ultimately, that is just a conspiracy theory, so completely ignore that if you want to. But taking a look at the Red Bull's lap times overall, we can see that there was a 3.5 difference between the two drivers across the entire race in favour of Max Verstappen. However, across stint number 1, Verstappen failed to set any clean air laps, and in stint number 2, it was actually Perez who was the slightly faster car in clean air by just 0.06 of a second, and then both drivers actually ran a stint number 3, where again Verstappen was just 0.09 faster on the hard compound of tyre. And so moving from Red Bull, we'll now take a look at McLaren, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 24.6% of the race, it was Daniel Ricciardo in the blue who was the faster of the two cars, and for 75.4%, it was Lando Norris in the orange. And we can see that it was Lando Norris who had about a 3 to 4 tenth advantage consistently over Daniel Ricciardo in that first stint up until their first round of pit stops. However, post these pit stops, we see that they are dead even once again, and the gap stays consistently at 12.5 seconds for around 15 laps. However, after that VSC period, Lando Norris opens up almost a second per lap difference between Daniel Ricciardo. Unfortunately, Lando Norris did actually have gear shift and brake issues with his car, so he was fighting a losing battle. But taking a look at the overall McLaren lap times, we can see that between the pair, there was a 6.5 tenth difference in Norris's favour. Where again, across stint number 1, this was the most exaggerated difference between the two drivers at just over 6 tenths. However, in stint number 2, Ricciardo was able to close this gap. However, this could have been due to Norris's gear shift issues, where it was now just 2.5 tenths between the two drivers. Then from McLaren, we'll take a look at Aston Martin, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 43.9% of the race, it was Lance Stroll who was the faster of the two cars in the pink, and therefore for 56.1%, it was Sebastian Vettel in the dark green, who was the faster of the two Aston Martins. And much like the Red Bull graph, they were actually dead even throughout this entire Grand Prix. Both drivers were extremely consistent in the first stint and improving at literally the same rate, with the gap staying at 2 seconds for 20 laps. Then it gets slightly more inconsistent after the first round of pit stops, where it's Lance Stroll who comes in before Sebastian Vettel by a couple of laps, with both cars having to get out of the way of lapped traffic. They then have the VSC period, and then after the VSC period they have some slow laps, again being lapped. However, it is in this final stint that Sebastian is able to increase the gap from 2 seconds to 5 seconds once they call in the safety car. So taking a look at Aston Martin's lap times across this entire Grand Prix, there was a 5.5 tenth difference in the Germans' favour. However, in stint number 1, it was Stroll on the mediums who wasn't able to set any clean air laps, and stint number 2, there was a 4.5 tenth difference in Vettel's favour. So moving away from Aston Martin, we'll now head to Alpine, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, for 62.1% of the race it was Esteban Ocon who was the faster car in the white, and therefore for 37.9% in the dark blue, it was Fernando Alonso. And much like the Aston Martin lap time chart before, we see that they were dead even. Ocon was maybe a touch more consistent in the first stint, with Alonso actually having a few quick laps, and then a couple of slow laps, a couple of quick laps, and a few slow laps. Ocon comes in for an extremely early pit stop around lap 16, where he is sort of able to take advantage of the fresh tyres compared to Fernando Alonso. However, it's sort of switched. It's now Ocon who is the slightly more inconsistent driver in stint 2, with Alonso setting the more consistent improving lap times. And then in stint number 3, after the virtual safety car, we see that both drivers have to contend with being lapped, and again, they're setting fairly consistent lap times, solid 1 minute 29s, but they aren't really improving. So taking a look at the Alpine's lap times overall, there was a 2.5 tenth difference in Alonso's favour for the final round of this season. With stint number 1, Ocon wasn't able to set any clean air laps on his softs, with Alonso running deep into the race on his hards. Then in stint number 2 they switch, Alonso goes onto the mediums and Ocon onto the hards, and there is an almost 6 tenth difference between the two drivers. So from Alpine, we'll now head over to Ferrari, and we can split their percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 65.5% of the race running, it was Carlos Sainz in the black who was the faster Ferrari, and therefore for 34.5%, it was Charles Leclerc in the red. Now, interestingly, this was one of Leclerc's slightly weaker races. He really didn't have the pace at all to compete with Carlos Sainz, and I'm not really sure what happened. He sort of lost out in that VSC period, where actually Carlos Sainz benefited. We can see that across stint number 1, there's probably a 10th per lap difference between the two drivers, with Sainz being just that little bit more consistent than Charles Leclerc. However, post first round of pit stops, it's Leclerc who starts to fight back, and he is actually around 2 to 3 tenths quicker than Carlos Sainz on this occasion. However, it isn't until after the VSC period that the gulf opens up, and this is a significant gulf. It is close to 2 seconds at some occasions, where the gap rises from 20 seconds after the VSC period at lap 36 to almost 40 seconds when the safety car is called out. So quite what happened to Leclerc in stint number 3, I'm not 100% sure. But looking at the Ferrari's lap times overall, we can see that there is a 1.3 second deficit between Sainz and Leclerc. With Leclerc not setting any clean air laps in stint number 1, and across stint number 2, where Leclerc was actually considerably slower, it was 2.7 seconds the difference between the two drivers. But moving from Ferrari, we will now head over to Alfa Tauri. We can split their percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 62.1% of the race, it was Yuki Tsunoda in the white who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 37.9% it was Pierre Gasly. And this is one of the first times this season that Tsunoda has had the majority of the race being the faster car. And we can see that all his hard work paid off in this opening stint, where he was at times half a second, sometimes even a second per lap quicker than Gasly, able to open up that gap to 14 seconds by lap 20. It's at this point that Tsunoda comes in for his pit stop a couple of laps earlier than Pierre Gasly, and after this they're pretty much even, the gap staying at around 10 seconds. However, Gasly benefits massively from being able to pit under the virtual safety car, and we see the gap is reduced down to 6 seconds. Then it isn't until Sergio Perez's shock retirement from his podium positions that actually boosts the AlphaTauris up to P4 and P5. A stellar finish. But looking at the AlphaTauri's lap times overall, there is a half a second deficit in clean air in Gasly's favour. Where it was Gasly in stint number 1 who failed to set any clean air laps, and then in stint number 2 on the mediums, where Tsunoda was on the hards, there was just a 1/10.5 difference between the two drivers. Then from AlphaTauri, we'll take a look at Alfa Romeo, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for the laps raced, which was only 25 when they were together on track, 76% of those it was Giovinazzi in the white who was the faster Alfa Romeo, and therefore for 24% it was Kimi Räikkönen. Now this was a really unfortunate end to both Alfa Romeo drivers' careers, having to retire due to technical issues for both cars. But we can see in stint number 1 that both drivers were literally dead even. The gap slowly rose to about 5 seconds in Giovinazzi's favour across 16 laps. And it's here where we see Kimi Räikkönen's issue with his brakes, where he actually put it into the barriers before coming back to the pits to retire the car. So looking at the overall Alfa Romeo's lap times, we can see that Räikkönen didn't actually set any representative clean air laps in this Grand Prix. I think he did actually set a few, they were just really quite slow. And in stint number 1, we can see that Giovinazzi was equally quite slow, setting a 1 minute 36 on the mediums compared to his 1 minute 29 in stint 2 on the hards. So penultimately, we will take a look at Haas. However, they only ran one car, so there is absolutely nothing that we can take a look at, and no point in comparing the teammates, as there is no teammates to compare them to. So we will finally take a look at Williams. And splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 53.8% of the laps raced together, it was Nicholas Latifi in the blue who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 46.2% it was George Russell in the white. And it is not for the first time that Nicholas Latifi was actually the faster race car in the Williams than George Russell. However, we can see in stint number 1 that they were setting near enough identical lap times, but both drivers were exceptionally inconsistent. They started in the 1 minute 32s, they managed to increase this up to the 1 minute 31s in around 15 laps, but then they started to go all wibbly wobbly again. But the gap stayed consistently at 4 seconds for 24 laps right up until Russell's retirement. But unfortunately, due to Russell's early retirement, that is all the analysis I can do on this panel, so we can take a look at their clean air lap difference across the whole race, and it was actually 8 tenths in Latifi's favour. Where in stint 1, where both drivers ran the mediums, it was actually 3/10 in Latifi's favour, where his whole race value is actually benefited by his stint 2 performance, a 1 minute 29.4 on the hards, which Russell wasn't able to compete with as he ended up retiring. And there we go, there is the last race data analysis all concluded for this 2021 Formula 1 season. Please let me know of anything in the comments down below that you found interesting about this analysis, or anything you'd like to see extra between now and the start of the next Formula 1 season. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.